People who grew up poor, what did you used to think was normal? In 4th grade we had a book exchange and the rules originally said it could be a used book in good condition, but the one clique of bitchy girls pissed and moaned so much that the teacher changed it to new books only. I still gave a gently used book. Bitchy girls said to, which always struck me as bizarre because it's a fucking book, not underwear. I swear schools really don't think about poor kids. I went to Catholic school, so we wore uniforms. We used to have dress down days where you could wear whatever you want and you'd have to pay $2. The money collected would go to charity. I remember some kids would forget the $2 or just show up in uniform and say they forgot it was dress down day. The kids who didn't bring the $2 would get in trouble, and obviously as kids all we think is wow, this kid couldn't even bring in $2, or wow, this kid is in uniform while everyone else is in regular clothes. As I got older I realized a lot of these kids were probably not well off financially, and here was the school punishing them for not bringing in money. In Canada, Ontario Catholic schools aren't private. They are part of a different school board than public schools, but they are still free to attend. My elementary school was in a middle class area. Just to clarify, because it definitely wasn't a super rich kid school. Yeah, we went to those fancy western fast food places. They were still good in my country back in the 1980s, and I always wondered what the other families there were celebrating. Not completely innocent. Kid me did figure out maybe they went a teensy bit more often than we did, but I still thought they were at least there for some occasion. Birthday, dad got a raise, sports team won, whatever. Didn't cross my mind at all that people would go there for no reason other than they just felt like it. Years later I got my first paycheck and went fuck yeah and bought an entire cake. Turns out it's not actually possible to eat a whole cake by yourself in one sitting. Like, goddamn, there's so much freaking cake.
As a kid I didn't know there were multiple settings on a water heater. I assumed everybody had to wait an hour or so after somebody uses the shower to get some hot water going. I am embarrassed to admit that I recently found out about continuous flow of hot water 5 years ago. I was 25. I spent the weekend at my then future in-law's house. The conversation went something like this. Fiancé, I'm going to shower before dinner. Me, but your brother just got out 5 minutes ago. Fiancé explains how they never run out of hot water. My mind was blown. When I was a kid, Mom would take me to the river to see the ducks. It wasn't a playground or even a park, just a little place where the ducks gathered and there was some space to play around. That or watching construction equipment, watching a train. I'd be fascinated by stuff like that, and in a way maybe I still am. We did go on a few vacations that cost money, but those times on the riverbank are more special to me.
I remember going to university and my friends would complain about how their parents were forcing them to go to Cuba or Aruba on a family vacation. Hell, even down to Florida or to see the Grand Canyon. I was always shook. Like, wait, people want to pay for you to experience things and it's a problem. I always got depressed listening to it. I grew up thinking food was a scarcity. Whenever we went anywhere my mom would tell me, and my sisters, to not accept food from people. She didn't want our hunger to be someone else's burden. Now that I'm in college and go places, like my boyfriend's family's house, it's seen as rude to refuse food. My automatic response is to politely refuse, even if I hadn't eaten all day. Even after years, and now being able to mostly get by myself, it still sometimes feels like being hungry is a normal state. I sometimes still forget to eat. My stomach will tell me I'm hungry, but because it was so ingrained in me that hunger is normal, I typically won't realize I'm hungry until I get a headache. My girlfriend grew up poor, and I feel like she does this to a fault. Doesn't matter what it is, if we don't eat it, it's going home with us. This just led to a fridge full of leftovers and me throwing them all away because they are over a week old and haven't been touched. 7 to 14 years old, going to school then going to work. After school delivering newspapers and also collecting their payments. Never a day off. One time we had so much snow that the post office closed. Yet my little ass had to deliver. Latchkey kid at 10 years old because parents worked. Being a girl, I was also responsible for cooking dinner for my father and older brothers and other household chores. I was also expected to excel at school. I did. My schedule was so strict. One thing I hated the most were science fairs. All the rich kids had so much help and confidence. Then there was me with a piece of cardboard, loads of stress and anxiety. Living in a tent, buying second-hand clothes, and passing them down to my pocket younger sister when I outgrew them. Always repairing clothes. Spending time around the welding yard where my dad worked because he had no other place to put us. Things worked out. My mom started her own company and my dad got a job at Ubisoft. He does third modeling for Far Cry now. Sister is a dog walker and married to a millionaire developer manager at Shopify, and I make good money in business development. I don't think many poor families get that. Not me, but my dad grew up dirt poor in India. We are upper class in the US now. He would tell me how he would get shoes, not new shoes, just shoes. So India is primarily a Hindu nation and there are temples everywhere. People leave their shoes and sandals in front of the temple before entering in order to not track dirt into the temple. So my dad would go to a temple to pray. He would ask God for a pair of shoes and just walk out with someone else's shoes that fit. Rinse and repeat. I'm 60 and as a small child I lived with my grandparents for a couple of years on a small farm in the middle of nowhere. I have used an outhouse, which was worse. Winter you froze your butt off, or summer, where you often felt something hairy walking on your hind end, a telephone attached to the wall with a crank, and later we had a party line where all your neighbors could listen in on your telephone calls at will. No bike but an old wagon that had been owned by my stepdad when he was a kid, and nearly all my clothes had been handmade by my grandma. On the other hand, we had a giant garden and everything got canned, so all our food was completely homemade and delicious, including ice cream, and she and I would regularly go looking for wild raspberries, asparagus, horseradish, and rhubarb. Everything was so fresh. One of my duties was catching a hen and holding it while grandma chopped its head off. I'd wait until it stopped running around and take it to the basement, where she'd pluck it and then made chicken noodle soup for that evening's supper. When we were very young, my sister and I didn't know you could take toys home from Walmart. My parents would let us play in the toy aisle for a little while, and when it was time to go, we put everything back and went home. We never asked for the toys or threw a fit, because as far as we knew, the toys permanently stayed at the store for kids to play with while they were there. Living off of a part-time job. My father became disabled from a work injury when I was only 2, so my entire childhood he never worked and always stayed home. My mother worked part-time as a pharmacy technician and at most made about $9.50 an hour. I grew up a single child, so between my dad's disability checks and my mum's couple $100 checks we got by. I have been working 45 plus hours a week since I've turned 18 just to get by. Sometimes I had 2 or 3 jobs and many roommates and still struggled. I'm now lucky enough to live and save money from one decent paying job, but I'll always be impressed and thankful my parents managed their money well enough for us to live well and instill good habits upon me. I grew up poor in rural Ohio, not quite Appalachia but real close. I lived in a single wide trailer with my mom. I remember helping my mom make the grocery list knowing we only had $20 to spend for the week, playing in the garden hose and sitting in front of the box fan because we didn't have air conditioning, getting free movies from the library instead of Blockbuster, etc. Honestly, I wouldn't trade it for anything. I learned how to be independent. All the number crunching made me great at math, but most of all, as cheesy as it is, I learned the best things in life really don't cost anything. I lost my mom to Wells a few years back, and there's nothing I wouldn't give to be sitting in front of that box fan with her watching bad movies. I'm sure this isn't true for everyone, but when I look back on my life and think of the times when I was the happiest, they never match up to the times when I had the most money. It's usually the opposite. Whatever your problems are, there is someone out there that would love to have them, because what they are going through is so much worse. No matter how bad life can get, there is always something to be thankful for. 3. Not having a winter coat. Grew up in Michigan. I'd layer a sweater of mine, and my dad would give me one of his sweaters. He couldn't afford to buy me one, and I could tell it destroyed him. He owned a business, and after employees and bills were paid, he didn't have much left. I still appreciate what he did for me. I was this tiny little middle school girl with a gigantic men's sweater on that would end up soaked on the bottom from the snow. So every winter I make it a point now to donate some new winter jackets to the schools. Having one pair of shoes last me years. Parents would save up a decent amount, nothing too crazy, and spend about $75 to $100 on shoes, but only once my feet had completely grown. I wore the same shoes from 6th 10th grade. Thought it was normal. However, I didn't exactly grow up poor, just my parents had made stupid decisions with money that often led to shortages of it. They always made sure we were fed and had a roof, even if we hardly went out to eat or on vacations. They sacrificed a lot for themselves, so my sisters and I could have a good childhood. I just turned 22 and recently started making more money at my job. My dad looked at me with tears in his eyes and said, "I'm so happy that you and your family won't have to go through what we had to do." I wasn't making the money you're making until I was 34. Honestly, love that man to death. I used to think it was normal to never be inside. I had a neighbor who lived 10 minutes away on bike. I would be outside from the time I brushed my teeth to sunset, either riding bikes, fixing cars, collecting scrap metal, cutting logs for the fire. Normal poor people stuff, but I didn't realize people sat inside all day until 7th grade when I went to my friend's house and played Halo 3 for the weekend. Was never yelled at to go outside, never wanted to go outside. We took our food into his room. That is unheard of in my house. I was poor and severely abused as a kid. I thought it was normal to wear clothes that were old and full of holes, stains. I thought it was normal to wear hand-me-downs, and I thought it was normal that parents beat their kids to make them behave. I went over to a friend's house in kindergarten for a sleepover and birthday party. Her mother was so nice and loving, and the daughter, the girl who I was friends with, it is her birthday. She had lots of new toys, nice house, lots of nice food, clothes. I felt very sad at the sleepover because I knew I wasn't getting loved at home, didn't have new clothes or toys. I cried when I got home. We were very poor and lived in the country, and I was sad because my neighbors had horses and I wanted them and still do. I'm going to have some in Canada. I wore the same Harley old shoes for 3 years, had ratty old clothes with stains and holes, and begged kids for school lunches and treats and candy. I was very sad and severely abused by my parents. My dad was a heavy alcoholic and beat us. All I ever wanted was to be loved, to be someone's baby. I grew up in and out of homeless shelters. Sometimes my family would go camping and we would stay under a bridge that was close to the shelter. Or we would go to hotels which were just different homeless shelters. My family made a habit of walking to the nearest Walmart and then going around to the back and getting the clothes or food out of the dumpsters in the truck loading area. I remember when we finally got to rent a house and my parents both had jobs. My parents would finally let me have friends come over, which I didn't even know was a thing. I had lived my whole life thinking you only saw friends at school and that was it. When it got really bad and we could afford that house anymore, we went on a vacation to my grandma's house. My parents dropped my sister and I off and disappeared for a year. To this day they won't tell me why they did that or what they did without us. But I put the pieces together and I think they just decided kids were too expensive.